Good afternoon, everybody. There is plenty of food today. Don't seem to get it right. Sometimes we have too little, not enough, but today we have it right. And there are also cookies there for people that love cookies on that side. For you don't know me, I'm Pavlos Protopappas. I am the Scientific Program Director for the Institute for Applied Computational Science. You're here for the seminar. This is a seminar series that addresses different aspects of computational science, data science, and the likes. The seminars are addressing sometimes different domains, sometimes interesting algorithms or machine learning. But today, in particular, we're addressing the issue that to do data science, you need to have the data, and in order to have the data, you need to be able to access the data. So there is plenty of research about how to access data fast, but the interesting thing about this talk is from the big institution point of view, how you share data. So Chris is going to talk about that, and I will allow James Cuff, our Director of Research Computing at Harvard. If you don't know James, you should take a picture. Yes. But before I do that, let me just remind you, next week's seminar is Bruce Schneider. He's talking about privacy, but he's not going to be here. It's a bigger event. It's part of the Boston Hub Week. It will be at Science Center B1, B3, Hall B, no more. And unfortunately, we're expecting a lot more people, and so we're not going to have lunch. I'm sorry for that. It's the only time we're not going to have lunch. So I'm going to like James Cuff, who is the Director of Research Computing at Harvard. He is the person who runs Odyssey and everything else, to introduce Chris. Thank you, James.
Good afternoon, everyone. So this is a great pleasure, actually, to get Chris here. So I was reminiscing about how Chris and I first met, and I just got off a plane in Boston from the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute, and the job I was given at the Broad Institute then was to take our production sequencing pipeline and move it off this technology called DEC Alpha onto something called Itanium. None of those are no longer with us as technologies, which was quite sad. And yet Chris and I were sat in an Itanium training class together, looking at each other going, this stuff's cool. We can like do parallel GZIP and stuff like that. And
like 2 cores.
on both cores at the same time. So it was a very, very exciting time. And Chris spent about 8 or 9 years with Bioteam, which is a pretty boutique consulting organization, and has a great heritage at Harvard. Both Erin Kitzmiller and Michelle Clamp are both Bioteam alumni, so we've got a great catchment area for bringing talent into the university. As part of Chris's engagement at Bioteam, he helped stand up the New York Genome Center, which is just this intergalactic federation of New York universities putting together a next-generation sequencing platform. And then they were smart enough, Mara Trinell, who's now moved on to the Hutchins, the Hutch in Washington, snagged Chris as his Director of Research Computing. Currently, there's a gap that Chris is filling between the research computing services and all IT at the Broad. But I've heard him talk a number of times before, and you're in for a real treat. So with that, Chris Dwan of the Broad Institute. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an absolute thrill to be here. I have to admit, I don't know most of you. So just for me, are there any sort of undergrad level people? Excellent. Beginner mind, I love it. Graduate student? Okay. Postgraduate fellow? Okay. Faculty? Some faculty. Computationalists, people who deal with numbers and symbolic processing and stuff like that. This is my family. This is the language I speak by default. Biologists or life scientists of any stripe. 1, cool. I speak your language as a second language. And okay, so that's you. I started off in artificial intelligence. Like Jim said, I started off teaching missiles to hit tanks rather than trucks using machine learning. This was back when we called deep learning perceptron networks, and didn't find that terribly ethically satisfying. So I jumped over to trying to make soybeans take less fertilizer. which, you know, if you could do that, you could save a lot of money on feeding the planet. And now I'm over at the Broad. And I always start with my conclusions, in case you have to go, having had lunch. And the good news, the conclusion that I'll focus on mostly here, is that the fundamentals still apply. We are absolutely not out of a job as technologists or computationalists because of cloud technologies, because it's all solved, because, you know, everything is simple. In fact, this is our time. In fact, we are at a point where most science that I can see, particularly the life sciences, is gated by our ability to bring data sets together and meaningfully compute over larger and larger swathes of what humans know about biology. And this is a technology problem. Technology is about reducing latency, usually. And the latency between researchers, between idea and testing that idea and using the tested idea to help people is mostly on us now. It's really exciting and cool. So we are not out of jobs, and there's tons and tons of work to do. I used to brag about how many petabytes of information the Broad has. I really don't like to do that anymore because nobody cares. A piece of that is because, you know, we're in the tens of petabytes, and the Facebooks of the world are in the exabytes. If you want to impress a storage vendor, you tell them you're going to stand up an exabyte scale facility that is global this year, right? So I have tens of petabytes. Who cares? I claim that understanding our data, understanding it particularly at intersecting points between different scientific disciplines, is super, super hard. I happen to know that most of my information on our spinning rust at the Broad is duplicated. We say that that's for disaster recovery. I can't think of a disaster from which we would recover because of this duplication, right? We're just keeping additional copies of stuff, and it's costing money that could be going to pay research salaries or, you know, frankly, feed hungry people. You know, I would rather do this sort of good of the world stuff on not my own ego about the size of the disk drives, but really honestly, cost effectively. There's a meme that I want to put out there, which is that we need to stop talking about moving data. People who don't deal with data for a living frequently talk about the data coming off of the instrument, and then we move it to the high-performance storage, and then we move it to the more cost-effective storage, but then we move it over to the collaborator site, and we maybe delete this, and then we reformat it, but then we move it back over to the cluster attached. This is brittle, and it is fundamentally unscalable. Instead, data should be archived someplace that is durable to the failure of any particular geography and is cost-effective at scale and is accessible from the various computational frameworks that you want to use. And then everything else you keep around because it's there for a reason, because it's useful, right? There are a lot of data pipelines where we're moving and moving and reformatting and moving and really doing the thing Knuth told us not to do, which is prematurely optimize on cost rather than solving the problem. Object storage, I'll talk a little bit about this. This is how you build an exascale framework, and it is just different from files. It's different from files in the way that file-based storage is different from block storage. Elasticity in compute, we do a lot of cloud computing, and elasticity in computing means that you have a lot of CPUs that you use immediately for a very short time. Elasticity in data, you know, I don't actually generate a tremendous amount of data for 2 hours and then throw it away, usually. That's more of a physics thing. Elasticity in data is that I can get the data to those cores, whether they're in my basement, in Amazon, in Google, in Azure, in your basement. Elasticity in data means connectivity, throughput, and low latency. Elasticity in compute means tons of computers sitting around waiting to be hired. And they're just different. So when I talk about going to the cloud computationally, it's very, very different from going to the cloud data-wise. All right, so that's it. Anyway. So the Broad is up the street. We're at Kendall. We're about 10 or 11 years old. We were started as a collaboration of Harvard and MIT by a man named Eric Lander. I have people on my staff who say they've been at the 10-year-old Broad for 16 years. This is because they were a system administrator to Lander when he was at the Whitehead. It's a small community. We have perhaps 700 research staff. We have perhaps 50 or maybe 300 faculty, because our faculty are all cross-appointed at the local and world universities. We're BU and MIT and Tufts, and I'm sure I'm forgetting one. But so my whole world is about connections between the various institutions. Everybody has access to a supercomputer, right? We also have a supercomputer, or a bunch of computers that sit near each other and sometimes are harnessed together. The number that keeps me up at night is that 2,400, where we've got about 700 people who we pay. We've probably got about another, actually that's wrong now, it's already wrong. It's about 3,000 folks who we don't pay a salary, but the way that I share our resources is by giving them VPN credentials and letting them log into the systems. This is sharing as I make you me. And that is fundamentally unscalable, right? Especially if you also have a joint appointment at someplace interesting like the Wellcome Trust. So now you've got 3 email addresses, 2 of which you don't read, you know, and you've got, and it just gets worse and worse. This is not a way to collaborate. It's a hack around the fact that we don't have a technical solution for actually sharing data and resources. We do a lot of DNA sequencing, but the Broad is really interesting in that you've got chemists and computational chemists, which are still different, and small molecule folks and therapeutics folks, and all of these different areas along the chain from basic biology out to curing disease, all in the same building, all working on projects together. We are neither fish nor fowl. We're neither an academic institution. We don't grant degrees, but we have a lot of trainees. Nor are we a biotech. We don't really talk about profit and loss. We don't really want to hold intellectual property. It's a great place to be. If you have an opportunity, come on over. We have a great mission, and I've really gotten up close and personal with the fact that this screen is not like that screen, but that's okay. The part that I like is that we are about accelerating, propelling the understanding and cure of disease. And how do you do that as a technology? It turns out technology does not have a separate mission statement from that. It's the acceleration part that I want. I want to reduce the latency between opportunity to do good science and good science. So, I like this quote a lot. If you're at ought to know your own mind, it's because, if you're at odds to know your own mind, it's because you don't have anything but your mind to know it. This is why I come out and do these talks, is because there are facts that I can't see from where I sit. Everything makes sense if you're in the echo chamber of your own institution. So I very much want you to interrupt me, ask questions, force me to say things in different ways. Because, you know, and I've got to talk, I've given it a couple of times. It's absolutely necessary that we talk back and forth with great openness and courage as we try to solve these problems. So, this is an up to the end of August slide. I should update it. We are generating 338 trillion base pairs per month. So that works out to something like 2,000 whole human genomes per month. Last month. Turns out September is, again, on that same exponential curve. It's about 170 megabytes per second. You know, so we've actually saturated a 1 gigabit link out of the laboratory building, which it's a substantial amount of data. It's not Facebook, it's not YouTube, but it's heavy. And this is the context of the past 7 years or so. And this is not going to stop. Like, I think I have some color commentary here where we started talking about data tsunamis on the far left, on the part that you can't even see. The colors are generations of instruments. So this was something called the GA2, and this was something called the HiSeq, and this is the HiSeq 2000, you know. And now we're getting into these $1,000 genome instruments called the HiSeq X, and this is version 2 of the HiSeq X generating this data. Down here, we had a whole institute dedicated to sequencing a few people, a few samples. Over here, we're doing, I think, about 10,000 samples a month, of which 2,000 or 3,000 are whole genomes, and the others are sequencing various pieces of the genome. This is the part where you start hearing about, like, Obama's precision medicine initiative, where we sequence populations. You know, so this is just the beginning. This is me, a couple thousand a month. There are nations like Estonia who are going to actually do genome sequences on most of their population. You know, it's a small country. It's only a couple million. You know, nations like the United States will soon follow. Kind of wish we would lead, but we will soon follow. So we're going to have to figure out how to put this all together, and it will not all be in one place. That's really critical. Like, even if I get this graph to the ceiling, it will not be the case that I will have all the genomic data in the world. And the interesting science is done against as large a data set as you possibly can get. All right, so we've done the statistics. We've got a terrible terribly high dimensionality problem trying to get information out of genomic data. There's like 3 billion locations on your genome. They each vary to some extent. And trying to find the needle in the pile of needles that is the interesting needle for you. It's not even a haystack, right? It's actually a pile of useful stuff. You know, the math indicates that somewhere around 10,000 or 20,000 individuals in a cohort where we've got their full genome, we could start to address fairly simple genetic diseases, you know, diseases with a genetic component, and not be too terribly led astray by the dimensionality of the data. Somewhere at about 100 or 200,000 samples, you start going into things like diabetes and autism and some really complex diseases that have a strong genetic component, but we just haven't made much progress on it, right? So I think that we have about that scale of data in the world right now, but we can't do the experiment because it's scattered. It's all over the place. And this is another thing. I would like to see next year's science done this year because we use technology appropriately. I think that would be really cool. You know, we could actually wait for the Broad to get up to 200,000 whole genomes. You know, it'll take some number of months, some number of years that's measurable in, you know, small numbers. Or we could do it now. So this is where I joined the Broad. Really interesting bit. So these are all the bytes. We've got a ton of bytes, you know. This is an amazing resource, which EXAC, an exome, is the protein coding section of a genome. It's maybe 1 to 10% that we pretty much know what to do with it. So a man named Daniel MacArthur over at Mass General put together the Exome Consortium, and he published 60,000 exomes for the general scientific community. He figured out all the privacy stuff, he figured out how to make it accessible, and he fit it all in about a terabyte of MongoDB, because he actually did the data modeling to only present and store that which was actually useful. And that was huge because this is, you know, a petabyte or so of raw data, which would have been a challenge. That still costs us $1 or $2, right? You know, a terabyte is straightforward to hang off a web server. And you can do things like have an East Coast and a West Coast copy to make it really fast. A petabyte is kind of challenged to keep in sync, you know. So because we actually modeled the data appropriately, he was able to do this really amazingly useful thing. Organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication system patterns in those organizations. Or if you have 4 groups working on a compiler, you're going to get a 4-pass compiler. If you have an IT organization and a science organization and they don't talk, you're going to have this limpy half-step solution. If you have a software engineering group in the middle of that, it's going to be weird. You're going to get a really weird algorithmic solution that doesn't match the hardware and that doesn't match the science if they don't talk, you know. And it gets worse, right? So this requires a certain amount of courage between organizations. This is one of the things that's great about where I work is that we're all right up against each other. We're not split into departments. We're not split into different organizations with separate profit and loss. We've got one really strong-willed leader who sort of just keeps saying velocity, you know, set aside all of those other provincial questions and solve the questions together. All over data science, you're going to run into these multi-team things where you have just a completely asinine solution to a problem because it's never been addressed holistically. And I encourage you folks to go ahead and ask the obvious questions like, why would you do that? Why would you write out that file in the middle and exchange that file? You know, why would you go ahead and, you know, why are we casting out various pieces in the middle? Usually it turns out that it's because you had a team whose job was to get to the billable part, which is this particular file, and another team whose job it was to try and do the analysis on a whole bunch of those things that they bought. It's as simple and as dumb as that. If I can convince my organization to stop dumping out an unnecessarily large number of bytes on the way because of something simple like that's where we invoice, or that's where the laboratory process stops, which is actually not yet useful for any science, I think we'll start to make real progress. Agent Smith was really weird and creepy when he said this, like never send a human to do a machine's job. But I have a lot of staff members who spend their time doing machine work. We've got this symbolic link forest of about 19,000 experiments that we've run over the past several years. And I have a human being whose job it is to make sure that that symbolic link forest is appropriately curated This is terrible. So there's also just some blocking and tacking, some cutting and pasting to be done in terms of, sure, it makes sense as a human to, in the small, when you have a principal investigator and a couple of researchers, let them sort of organize their own files. It kills you at 700 people. And at these points, and again, I encourage you, spend your lives on human work rather than machine work, and fight back vociferously when somebody says, I just need you to rename all of these 19,000 directories to be coherent. Write a program, So really getting collaborative requires you to think about IT in a slightly different way, I think. And this is still new. This is something that I'm test flying, On the bottom, you've got this idea of a traditional IT organization where responsibility devolves to somebody with a title like CIO or Director of IT. And you've got certain promises that person is making. Like if there's a device on the network, it's supposed to be there. And if it's one of my devices, it has an operating system that we've patched to certain standards, right? And if credentials are presented inside that network, I've put measures in place to verify that it's actually the correct person at the other end of the connection when electronic credentials come along. And if you're not using both on-prem and cloud services for that at this point, you need to take a hard look and ask why. Because everybody runs this model both in brick and mortar and in various clouds now, right? This is not like the cloud dream. This is just like cloud used as technology. There's another world that we've started to explore where researchers come up and they say, I want to use this crazy kernel that you've never heard of, this crazy distribution of Linux. You have no idea how to patch it, but it's the only one where I can get my code to work. Can I run that on your in-house servers? And I say, no, you cannot, because I have no idea how to patch it. But they say, can I get some of that Amazon compute to run it? And I can say yes, and we can pass through sort of billing accountability where you can use your broadcast object or your billing entity so I can get centralized billing. But the user runs free, and the really important thing is that it's the user's responsibility to obey the data use restrictions that they fundamentally know about. The thing about CIOs is that we don't actually know what all this data is, and so we have sort of walls to protect in sort of an absolute way. The users have a much more refined understanding of, or they should, because it's the data they're signed up to protect. So we had one, his name is Gordon Stansico. Was he there when you were there? No? Gordon is a great guy, and he really wanted some of that Amazon compute to do a thing. And he stood it up, and he got his bill, and he said, well, I'm being billed for network egress to China. Why am I being billed for network egress to China? I said, well, we took a look, and it's because China is pinging you, and your machine is answering. And you're being charged for the bytes that are going back to China. Also, were you aware China is trying to guess your root password? And nothing against China. All kinds of US hosts do this. All kinds of hosts from all over the world are constant. It's a very hostile environment. I said, so I'm certain that you didn't put up any confidential data on that host, like you said you were not going to. And he said, excuse me a moment. But this takes a certain amount of organizational courage to say, I'm going to have my users dragging me along in a new architectural direction, and I'm going to trust them, right? And this is something that people with titles like this have trouble doing because it's how we go to jail. But I think it's absolutely necessary to move faster than your traditional model can support. And then in the middle, there's where I think we're going. These are all in clouds because they're all running in Google and Amazon. We started off, we created this data science group that's like 40 people from all over the broad, software engineers, statisticians, interesting folks. And we made the DSDE, Data Sciences and Data Engineering Dev project in Google. And it just quickly became this morass of Mongo and CouchDB and some servers, and there's a thing here and a thing there. And we tried everything. And then we started building an actual cloud pilot where we've got a project from the National Cancer Institute to build basically a domain-specific cloud where it lives on Google and it has about 2.6 petabytes of National Cancer Institute information, and you can run cancer-specific analytic workflows on it. And we support the cloud, and researchers from all over the country come and run their jobs on it. And so we started actually standing that up. And the question was, well, we developed some cool stuff in the dev area. Do we want to also stand that up in every project, every instantiation of a service that we ever build? Do we want to just share by copying, right? And the answer was no. We took the things that we knew we needed, which were sort of identity management and system configuration management and a couple of others, stuffed them in a dedicated project that we could support, and connected via VPN to this other project. So now this is some services that are provided by the Broad connected into a project that, note that I've never said the Broad runs that project. This is all outside my own walls, and so we can actually connect directly. Some of our collaborators stand up other services. You know, the folks at UC Davis are standing up some of the necessary services and maintaining them and taking responsibility for them. Broad people are standing up some services and taking responsibility for them. And we're connecting those to a project that is neither us nor them. This feels a lot more like real collaboration than giving them a VPN token and running it off my web server, or doing the reverse, right? This is not how traditional IT organizations provide services. It's different and weird, and we're learning how to do it. And it's taking a lot of courage on both sides to be open about the fact that, no, I don't have a service catalog and a service level agreement on the timeliness with which I will stand one of these up, because I've never done it before. You know, and actually we don't really know which of these services is going to persist, but I believe that's the new model for working with your IT organization, is that groups of individuals will take responsibility for various services and will bring those services together in dynamic ways. So the future's already here. It's just not terribly well distributed. One of the bugaboos that bothers me is that most of the benefits of really modern computing technology have gone to finance and people who try to sell you things. And I work in a building with 700 people, many of whom are actually literally trying to cure cancer right now. And they have only limited access to stuff that marketers have been profiting from for years. This bothers me. Part of the reason is that, that research doesn't pay as well as marketing. You know, part of the reason is that we're not really good at communicating how cool it is how cool what we do is. So Cycle Cloud, actually this is, Jim spent a brief period at this company. They are a company that is good at taking traditional batch scheduled workloads. So in a batch scheduled compute environment, you've got a bunch of jobs to do. It's usually data parallel somehow. You define several thousand, tens of thousands of jobs. And the system sorts them according to business priorities. You know, we want to go fair between users if multiple users are submitting jobs. We want to go fair between various sorts of jobs. It sorts them, and then you go down the list from most urgent to least. And when you find one that you can dispatch, you do, because you're in a finite pool of resources. In the cloud, that's different. In the cloud, what you do is you don't even sort. You add up the resources you would need. You instantiate enough computers to kick it off, and you run everything. There's no scheduling, right? Cycle does this, and we took Cycle software, and I had the devil's own time getting people to actually try this, because researchers were very hesitant about this whole cloud thing. You know, what about security? Well, let me take the risk. You know, we'll lock it down some. Well, you know, what about cost? Am I just going to run up a huge bill? Who's going to pay it? Okay, I put some guardrails on, so you can't spend the whole budget. I promise you're not going to get in trouble. Oh, well, it's different. You know, it's a little weird. And then we finally hit a home run. You know, we finally found a set of researchers who were, and these folks, it's fascinating science. It's a project called Achilles, where we have 500 different cell lines of various sorts of cancer. And we have a technology where we can inhibit the expression of every one of 22,000 genes individually. And so for 500 against 20,000, we did the experiments. And the question is, for any particular type of cancer, is there a gene that if we inhibit it, kills that cancer cell and has no effect on anything else? That would be the Achilles heel of that particular type of cancer. So they had 10 million data points, and they had a pile of other data resources that were similarly rich and interesting, that just because of the shape of the data didn't take up more than a couple hundred gigs, so we didn't have to shift around a lot of data. And we went ahead and we used Google's preemptible instances which just means they can give you 30 seconds and take the host away. So that just means you've got a checkpoint. And we ran 50,000 cores for 2 hours. So at the Broad, we've got probably 17 or 18,000 cores of Linux server spread across all of these hundreds of researchers. They would never have been able to get this resource. When we started building it, the researcher estimated it at about 20,000 core hours, and it ballooned to 100,000. I was like, Phil, what's going on here? You know? And he goes, well, I finally realized you're serious, and it's an unlimited resource. So we're going to do the science we were always hoping to be able to do. That's why I do this job, right? Is to get technology out of the way of scientists. And it turns out that people were interested, you know, the New York Times called and stuff, because we're actually using this cloud computing thing to begin to address some things that are relevant to human health and disease. Note that this is not a cure. This is, the actual math was, where should we look next? Where should we focus our experimental energy? But people thought that was pretty cool. I'm super proud of it. I'm going to skip over that and get to some information management pieces. So a nightmare of files is a technical term for what keeps me up at night. And we have this model, we have this world where sequencers produce data that's written off to one filer. It's transformed by some process into another set of files. It's transformed, and then it's eventually used, right? And this is this data motion thing that I was talking about, where it gets expensive. This is your cluster-appropriate storage. And so you stage it off to something cheap. And now you keep symbolic links here, so you don't have to disrupt any of the precious Perl or Python scripts. And then these filers fill up, and so you've got more and more of a mess, right? And it's just fundamentally unsustainable. I'm not asking you to read any of this. It's just, over time, as you run a production data pipeline, you generate a mess. And one of the things that we did was, and I'll cruise up to here, we wanted an infinite-sized space. And so without actually fixing my mess, I'm going to retain my mess for the moment, but give myself breathing room. We created a file-based front end to cloud storage. So we're going to keep the bytes off in Google, but we're still going to present it as files. And this is, there it is. So when you actually connect, that's 8 exabytes on a single file system, which feels good, right? In research computing, we spend a lot of time playing the game with the disks, the Tower of Hanoi game, where you always have to put the smaller disk on top of the bigger disk. And we shift around data, always trying to make space to get it all together so we can do the computation. This is me winning that Tower of Hanoi game and saying I've always got a place to stash the data. It costs money, it's not terribly fast. I still have my mess. I still have a really terrible mess. But at least I am not worried about which of those file systems I can use. I can always push stuff off. This is not, however, the answer. And it turns out the edges are still rough. Like, we're writing 251 megabyte blocks every second. We have been for about 2 months. We're up to about a petabyte. And so the dashboard that would tell me how much space I've taken up doesn't exist yet. They said, could you just count up the objects? And ls doesn't keep up. Like, the count the number of objects function doesn't keep up with the writing of the data. You know, and Google helpfully wrote me a dashboard that stopped at 1 million, because, like, why would you ever store more than 1 million things in a bucket? I'm like, that's 3 days of production, you know. So I don't claim this is a solved thing, but at least I'm beginning to use technologies that are available to store exabytes for science. So I'm super proud, actually, that we ran out the information limits of file systems. You know, file systems fail at a couple of kind of well-known ways. At about 5 petabytes, they get wobbly. It starts to take a long time to get a failed disk out and get another one in. The real problem is, well, file system paths last forever. At about 1 billion objects, your directories are either too wide or too deep to find anything, especially if it's not just you keeping them. But the real thing about file systems that has failed me utterly is the access semantics are totally inadequate for collaborating, even between laboratories, especially outside of organizations. The access semantics on a POSIX file system are that you walk the path to get in, and you have to have permission to go into every subfolder, right? And then you, as an individual, can be a member of a group, or if you're on a Windows system, you can be on an access control list. But fundamentally, you walk down some path to get to a file, and that's how you get access. In the real world, the question is, what are you working on? Because human beings give consent for the research use of their data. And so if I'm working on sort of an exploratory thing, there's a lot of data that I can access. If I'm accepting money from a biotech that will eventually profit them, some people have said, I don't want to give pieces of my body to support biotech profit. So there's a role-based thing. And then in addition, you would like to be able to exclude some data from some experiments as a control. You just kind of have to trust people to do the right thing there. And then when you get into that world where I'm handing out thousands of network accounts to people who have accounts at other institutions, now it's just 100% mess, right? So object storage looks superficially like other storage. This is in my data center. This is about 2.6 petabytes of space. There's disks down here. There's servers up top. But what it is an HTTP-based access to information rather than a file-based access. You get a URL. And the URL should be pretty opaque, right? Because you're going to need some kind of a middleware in the middle to, appropriately, to tell you what information, where you go to get the bytes that you want. And it's just different. Like, it's got to be, we talk a lot about disaster recovery and copies. In webland, you say every byte, every set of information should be protected geographically. There should be copies in multiple geographies. That's super hard to do with files. It's just the way object storage works. There are many, many differences between object storage and file-based storage. Whitman, don't call the tortoise unworthy because she is not something else. So in a file system, I/O errors are terrifying. You get an I/O error, everybody out of the pool, check the disk, stop. In the web world, if you get a 500, you hit retry. And if it keeps failing, then you go check on it. That's disturbing for a lot of our pipelines, that, hey, there's probably a problem with our data. Let's stop. I've spent the last year yelling at EMC because object storage is not files, and they finally have convinced me I'm using it wrong, right? Similarly, on file-based systems, you're going to get a stream of data going and cruise because all your network connections are short. The frequencies are very, very high, and interruptions are very, very rare. So the retry cost, while high, is exceedingly rare to invoke. On the internet, your retry cost is super high. And so what you do is start multiple parallel streams. And you stream, the multi-part uploads and downloads if you want to get performance on the internet. It's just different. And so as you start to access data that's stored in an object store, you need to just think about it differently. And this is where we as technologists are going to be able to help a lot. We were talking about this before the talk, that when you go through graduate training in biology or in chemistry or in physics or whatever, you would really want to enrich for the biology or the chemistry or the physics, the thing you're actually studying. And we want to provide enough computational oomph to those people to let them be sensible and not waste too much resource. But I don't actually want half of a graduate training program in biology to be about data science. I would like to meet these folks halfway. And so as people come up and start to use systems, they know some Python, they know some Java. They have some very sensible practices for a beginner, and we will have to do a lot of meeting in the middle to say, well, no, it's not broken, it's just different. I will skim ahead through this and share one funny story before kind of wrapping up. The cloud is different. So we did an experiment last year to push 700T of data into Google just to see if it would work. What are the, can we even do this? And it worked fine. And then we were paying for 700T of data in Google, and we said, well, I think we're done with the experiment. Can we delete it? And Ray said, okay, it's done. On old filers, it takes a while. You get that, you hit return, and it takes a little longer than you think, and you hit Control-C. Google did not pause. My data was simply gone. On our filers at the Broad, we use the compute farm for everything, including clearing out space that we don't need anymore. And I've learned to not hit even my higher performing filers too hard because they crash. Google did not crash, right? So this is a new world. I'm going to put all of my data in this space where it can go away instantly. I have made the request for some semantics on deletion. to have sort of a two-key system or a pull request system or something to address the fact that it's super easy to create and destroy petascale data. So Ray actually did the right thing here. He had checked in person with the other 5 people on the list and gotten a thumbs up from all of them and just did what he was supposed to do. This is actually how DevOps people think now, is, well, why wait? You know, what's the big deal? So one thing that matters a lot to me, and this is, I think, where I can kind of bring it to a close, is that we have very few standards in genomics for exchanging information or for working together. And we have a standards body that is grinding with standards body speed and power towards some documents that will eventually be cast into code. Along the way, we also have to learn how to work together prior to the standards being written. So if you find yourself working on a project with genomics people, with bioinformatics people, working with anywhere along the spectrum between sort of DNA sequencing and producing cures, please reach out and check to see if anybody else in the world is working on that particular problem. And see if you could agree on at least like a file format, maybe an API, and maybe a repository to put the data where you could do some interesting access semantics in case somebody else ever wants to work on that kind of data. I think it's going to have to be nucleated by technologists, because the life scientists and the physicians, nobody's going to say they're unintelligent, but this is not their training. So I'm really very excited and passionate about what I do. I would love to work with any or all of you to propel the understanding and cure of disease. And with that, I'll close. Thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions.
You showed a picture of your on-prem object storage system.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering what exactly you're using, and if you're using the Avere as the caching layer between your on-prem object store and your...
I'm actually not using the Avere in front of the on-prem object store. The on-prem object store is from EMC. It's something that used to be called Atmos, and then it was briefly called Viper, and now it's called ECS. And with full candor, it doesn't quite work yet. I mean, it stores data. It has never lost data. But we keep leaning on it hard, and then things happen, and then we're like, oh, maybe we're using it wrong, and we adjust, and maybe they adjust some stuff, and that particular thing doesn't break anymore. And that's been true for every single object storage vendor I've tried, Google and Amazon included. Like the tech is just not quite baked yet, but it's getting there. Yes?
Can you say a little bit more about, you've got these thousands of users with credentials in various places. What happens if one of them doesn't want to do research but wants to do something really evil, like steal data for the purpose of assigning insurance? Or
So evil? There's a great, actually, I finally have the good, simple example. Has anybody else done 23andMe? You can get your genome did, and then you get like medical advice based on that, except they say it's totally not medical advice. You know, they have an API, and the FDA has started to call them on that. But they have an API where if you log in with your credentials and you're a nerd like me, you can sort of ask questions about your own genome and that of your family in ways that their website isn't ready to do yet. And some helpful young person checked in some code to GitHub that if you put it on a website, it'll say, you know, you can't see this website unless you log into 23andMe. And once you do that, it will exclude you based on ethnicity. That's all the API does. So stuff like that. If you wanted to build something that would exclude, you know, it's living memory for all kinds of horrible things like that happen. It's not just insurance. Insurance is a big one here. The answer is that we need to put more responsibility and accountability directly on the end users. So principal investigators who gather data have data use agreements and have responsibility for protecting their information. And right now, because of the way we're storing data, we kind of turn something of a blind eye to the fact that we're not really protecting, we're trusting, you know. And I think that moving to a world that is not file-based will help a lot, but fundamentally you also kind of have, we wind up trusting, you know, and there's really, you can kill anybody with any tool if you try hard enough. You know, there's not much you can do to get around a really malevolent idiot who's going to do something bad. The best part is that we don't even know what all information is in there yet. So we have things, right now, true story, if I have your first initial, last name, and your zip code, that's personally identifiable information, and I have to encrypt it if I'm going to store it on my corporate systems. Your genome right now legally is not considered PII. So Congress should actually do something about that. It will cause a lot of my computers to spend a lot of their time encrypting and decrypting, but I think we should, you know.
So if we take every human being living and we take the genome and we encode it, how much data we need to have it?
So the scare number is it's about 100 gigabytes for a genome, and there's about, what, 7 billion people? So like yottabyte-ish, you know, 100E or so.
So it's doable, right?
Yeah, it's totally doable.
So in 10 years, it's going to be on a thumb drive.
Exactly. It's what's cool about living in exponential time, is you see something with like just barely too many zeros, and you're like, I will wait 5 years.
So it is conceivable that if we live long enough, we have everything.
So the really fun one is that the best way to understand cancer for me right now is as evolution happening kind of in an undirected way within the cells of your body. So most cancers seem to start with either large-scale genomic rearrangements or point mutations that break some function. So the really interesting thing to do would be to continually sequence you at your regular doctor's appointments, several tissues.
So it's more time series.
Yes.
I like that.
He's Mr. Time Series.
And then the truly horrible part is that when you take a tumor biopsy, you get a mix of normal and tumor, and some of those things have mutated in ways that are like not useful to the tumor anymore. So really, we need single-cell sequencing.
So the next generation Fitbit will measure your genome as it goes.
Potentially.
Chris, I missed I saw a talk yesterday at Microsoft Research, and it was the group that you guys at the Broad are working with on your favorite topic, which is CRISPR. I wonder if you could just give the audience a bit of background into machine learning and the kind of computation that's going on in that world. I think it's probably of applicability to this group.
So I'm not actually totally spun up on that side. The machine learning that we're doing is a lot of classifiers to sort wheat from chaff and to try and find signal such that, so it's fairly expensive still to do like a whole genome or to do a big assay. The direction we need to go is to figure out which of these signals to identify and then get it down to a $1 or $2 assay that we can spin out widely and democratize. What were they talking about in particular?
So there's a 30mer that you can use to be able to do this gene editing. It got very excitable in Wired magazine that, you know, we could make custom people, and then this guy put some tweet out and the whole thing just exploded. And so the story was how to predict what these cassettes would be. And so now you're starting to be able to do brute force and machine learned 30mers as a matter of course. It was kind of fascinating.
Yeah, this technology is absolutely stunning. This is the sci-fi thing where we're going to be able to modify DNA in vivo in organisms without killing them. We don't have that part yet. But for single-celled bacteria, CRISPR works great. It's actually a way that bacteria prevent themselves from being torn apart by retroviruses. People are very, very excited about this because it's one of these where you could do almost literally anything. And there's a lot of math to be had there. There's a tremendous amount of math. Honestly, I don't understand all of it. I sort of stand by and I look at our patent attorney getting very, very tired and stressed out. You know, and I see our mathematicians getting super excited and they say something new and exciting and she gets more stressed out. So.
More questions? All right, Chris is going to be around for a while. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.